All right. Good morning. Good afternoon, Sweden. Good morning from
morning, America.
Good morning, Vietnam.
Morning, Vietnam.
Okay, well, we're taking on last time we did Benita Roy in conversation with Brendan Dempsey and his podcast Metamodern Spirituality. And this is very much what they're trying to establish, I think. Of course, Jonathan has found he sort of accidentally was trying to establish that in his biography. And as he describes his move from being a master chess player to grandmaster chess player to a playing professional chess, and then moving into this work that was community-based for the Royal
Society of Arts, RSA.
Royal Society of Arts, RSA, very prestigious institution, I understand. And he sort of tripped into an assessment of the need for a spirituality that he describes, which we'll get into a little bit, and reconciling
the social question, isn't it? That's what he was.
That's what the social problem, as he says. Yeah. Yes, and it's a good way to frame it. I will say my experience here, while being very moved by this conversation, it was quite a seamless conversation throughout, and there was a nice mutual respect and tension created where there was some pushback, and when that happened, new things opened up, and I would just encourage everybody to watch this. This is as good as it gets, as far as I'm concerned, within this space, with these metamodern thinkers and integralists, people who are moving in those circles, who are cutting edge in the conventional intellectual space, I would say. And as we always say, we are trying to get anthroposophy in dialogue with these spaces, because one, it clarifies something for us, deepens an intimacy with reality, I would say. It also introduces to the world just how close anthroposophy is to these cutting edge movements, and how, the ways in which it can help these movements move beyond its self-limiting boundaries. And if Benita Roy was sort of partially channeling Fichte in her, in a sense, the German idealists in her approach, I would say that these guys are channeling the Victorians at the time when the whole science religion thing was trying to be worked out.
Interesting,
yeah. So you have all of these figures from that time. I don't even remember the name of them. My wife did a master's thesis basically on that time and these issues, and so Brendan evokes the existentialist, particularly Kierkegaard, and I feel all of that milieu in the room here, and they're trying to make a metamodern move. And I will say, this is my sort of summation critique, is that they're thoroughly modern in their mindset.
Yeah.
Right. And that's not a negative statement. I really mean it with deep respect, and we're all trying to make this move. So I'm sure there's plenty of my own sensibility that is that remains firmly in modernity, say.
Were you foreshadowing something there, Jeff, with sensibility?
Yes, I was. I was.
Yeah, thanks. I'm also going to do a mini introduction. We've Jeff and I have decided to sharpen things up a little bit, not make these videos quite so long. So one of the things we've done is we've taken two segments that we found particularly interesting each. So there's going to be a total of 4 segments. And that means we've missed out on a load of really good content. So really recommend if what you as listeners find, I'm having trouble with my words today, aren't I? If what we say sounds interesting to you, it's been it's been taken from fertile soil, which is this conversation. So I'd really recommend going and listening to it in its full, because there's lots of really interesting things going on there. And I was going to say something. It was specifically what you were talking to, Jeff, before this, the value of these type of conversations. Because one point that we won't cover today, which was on my list of possible areas to cover, was when they talk about bilingualism, which is around about the 50-minute mark, if I remember correctly. And when they say bilingual, they're meaning an understanding between traditions. And that's what you and I are trying to achieve, isn't it? We're learning the language they are using, because all of the way they describe things, because conceptually we have it, we can easily identify what they're talking about, and then we can translate it also into what feels like a comfortable language for us, like the realm of anthroposophy and the epistemology of Steiner. So in that sense, it is a genuine attempt on our parts to find some type of common language, because there are a lot of concepts where they use completely different words, but we feel ourselves like connecting deeply with what they're going, or understanding what are the battles that they are going through, and believing to understand a little bit why they are, and what's the cork that needs to be popped, what's the roadblock that needs to be cleared, so that they can find a way forward with their deeply interesting questions, of which there are multiple ones in this whole conversation. So yeah, looking forward to this one, and wanted to re-emphasize finally the point that you made of, if I think of all the videos that we've done, metapsychology and the Benito I want, this one definitely feels coming closest to a way forward, if I put it like that. We've covered lots of interesting ground in our other videos, but this conversation was quite special. So we are going to start with John, and this is the first selection by Jeff. Do you want to give a little intro, or should we just play it?
Let me just look at my notes real quick.
Yeah, sure.
I can go back and couch it. Let's just go ahead. I think we've introduced this pretty well. Let's launch it, and then
Sure.
And then I can couch where this moment came from.
Okay, great.
That was the kind of, let's say, narrative context in which this arises. So you asked the question, how did I define spirituality? So when you say spirituality, it has a noun-like quality. It's as if it's like tables, chairs, houses, cars, and spirituality. People go looking for it as an object in the world that can be sensed, heard, or felt, or whatever. And that's not the case. You're speaking of something interior, something between, something beyond, and therefore the composite noun spirituality risks losing that sense of what it is. So over a period of time, I realized what I was talking about was a sensibility. And this comes back to the metamodern thing again, right? Because it's often called a sensibility. And I was trying to get at what is a spiritual sensibility? What is it for somebody to have a spiritual sensibility? And it's something about an orientation to life in its fullness. And you could say vis-a-vis Tillich, it's ultimate concern. Mm-hmm. But I did actually take some care to actually word this. So let me just read it out, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Say here, I think of spiritual sensibility as a disposition towards reality, characterized by concern for the fullness of life, and experienced through simultaneous intimations of aliveness, goodness, understanding, and meaning. Those glimpses of wholeness and integration have a texture that is at once emotional, ethical, epistemic, and existential. The feeling of being alive, the conviction that something matters, the intuition that the world makes sense, and the experience that life is meaningful, respectively. More substantively, as indicated in part 3 of this book, cultivating spiritual sensibility is about deepening our engagement with questions of being, i.e. death, belonging, particularly love, becoming, the self, the soul, and beyond this, particularly the soul. The idea of soul is another question we can come to, but I distinguish between self and soul in the project. So love, death, self, and soul was a way into the project for people on the outside, because they're all terms that are more or less familiar.
Okay.
All right.
So why did you choose that one?
Well, I mean, first of all, the question, what is spirituality? I mean, who can answer that? And is it and it's totally worth answering. So before this, as he comes out of his speaking about his biography, and that he illustrates that he wrote a book called Spiritualize, and he brings in the book Metamodern. I don't know what it was called. Metamodern. It's a definitive book on metamodernism, I would say.
Yeah.
And it's a group of essays, and I believe it's a group of essays, and Zach Stein is one of the writers in it. I think that's the one I'm thinking of. In any case, Jonathan does a really beautiful job of describing what we're up against spiritually, and he's very, very precise with his language and the words, but also with the reality that those words have to have meaning, right? And all of the things that people aren't willing to talk about in a shared space, right? That people, you experience this. That people, maybe I tell somebody that my kids go to a Waldorf school, and then that's the Steiner thing.
Yeah, oops, change conversation.
Plays over, because we're so profoundly secular that anything that bridges the secularity with a real spiritual phenomenology is taboo, but it's unspoken public opinion taboo, so to speak. And we'll see this as we progress, because Jonathan makes actually a similar move when he's talking about the word soul. But he does name say what is loneliness, right? And we don't talk about what it actually means, because then we would be somehow vulnerable and without being able to contextualize the actual reality of what loneliness is, that sort of thing. And so then it moves into this definition of spirituality. And in the end there, we both knowingly smiled out loud, I would say, when he got to the beyond, and he called it soul, which is really what we would describe as spiritual. And we would suggest that it's not a sensibility, as he suggests, or an orientation. One has to have a sensibility and an orientation to remain open to phenomenological realities of soul and spirit, which we differentiate. And I'm sure this will be part of this conversation, or this part of the conversation. But it really turns in the degree to which there's impreciseness as relates to that beautifully written description of what spirituality is. It is all of those things, but it's also not merely an orientation or a sensibility. It's a ontologically complex, multidimensional reality that can be explored through art, science, and religious opening, or religious ritual, or religious or let's just say a spiritual scientific inquiry that involves all three of those.
I'm going to certainly not give a definition, because characterizations and stories are so much more powerful. That's why the ancients talked in stories and pictures rather than definitions, or at least one of the reasons. But I will try to characterize it in what I think are essential aspects of spirituality, and this in no way disagrees, but I'm trying to amplify certain areas that I don't hear talked about. It's like in this particular definition. So in a perverse way, I would call material science a form of spirituality, in the sense that it is searching for the truth. Truth searching is most definitely a spiritual quest. That for me is patently obvious. So in that sense, like from a limited perspective, you and I have no bones with like the materialists, in the sense that they are searching for truth. Yep, we love you. We're on board. It's like it's when you start venturing into realms, making assertions, deductive reasoning, where you shouldn't. That's where we start to have problems. So I've been digging a little bit into the Pistis Sophia. It's like on my Jung journey, Carl Gustav Jung's like journey this week. And I'm going to give it's like spirituality from a spiritual perspective as opposed to a materialistic perspective. So what is it that the Gnostics, how did they see the world? Well, God had an idea. God wanted to create a world, but he needed the help of Sophia to do the shaping, the material that it had to happen, but actually sort of like the concepts and ideas, the archetypes, the forms. She was there with those, and that's what we are trying to rediscover. Those Platonic ideas, to use yet another term, that's what we are interested in rediscovering, and that's what we believe we can do it is possible to do with the spiritual scientific process. And so mentioning once again the work that we did with the philosophy of freedom, none of this happens without thinking. You need perception as well, but it's like this clarity, this arriving at Sophia, this co-creator with God, cannot happen without thinking. And until you know what thinking is, you're going to be continually bumping into the type of roadblocks that they bump into, understandably. But if you really begin to come to terms with the philosophy of freedom and what's going on, then the relationship of thinking to reality, things start to filter out. All these, we might come, there are a couple of things, I'm not sure that we'll cover them. I'll flag it here in case it does come up in conversation. So he talks at, I don't know, about the 40-minute mark about the problem of the virgin birth. I'm not going to go into the details here and now, but that is used as a roadblock. What Jonathan doesn't realize is he is the creator of that roadblock. And that really does become clear once you understand how thinking is. I mean, that just knowing this doesn't resolve the problem, but it's like it throws you back on yourself and sort of like says, I've got this way of understanding the virgin birth, but is it the only way? Really interesting that they pick up on this. What is spirituality?
I think
we need to help them. We need to help them grow the idea of what it is. To what extent this bilingualism that I was talking about before. We're with you, fully on board with the material stuff, but I don't think you guys are with us on the spiritual stuff.
Yes, and I think what we've selected is not going to take us into this realm, but there's a subtext here that the scientific framework is super solid and it stands on strong epistemological ground, right?
Yeah.
And we'll get to this when we get to the social problem, because it explains the mass psychosis that we've just gone through very well, I think. And I'm not trying to be, catty or sardonic or anything like that. I'm really saying that we come very close to it in ways that they help us to get close to it from a different avenue, say. But in the backdrop here is there's spirituality, and then against that there's science, right? Science with a capital S, the one you follow. Right?
Scientism is what they
Yes,
should be
well,
saying.
In a sense, they're adherents to a scientism, in that there's something given about the ground there, but they're also questioning the result of let's say when that ground is one-sidedly holding sway, and there's sort of a wistfulness for the spirituality to bring in as an antidote, but it sounds pre-modern, not postmodern or metamodern in a sense. But
Try
they're
and
not.
unpack that for us a little bit. And how do you mean it sounds pre-modern?
Well, not so much with Brendan in the end. I think the way in which he comes to agency and choice, and when they're talking about that in individuation, I think the lovely thing is they both get somewhere here. But the subtext, because it's this sort of it's more Jonathan with the spiritual the spiritual nature of things, that the idea of surrender in relationship to the Christian theologic tradition, or the Buddhist theologic tradition, that you need to make a commitment into one. And I can agree with that to some extent. However, that kind of commitment would be to ignore the multi-perspectival nature of this. And we'll talk about this as I don't want to get too far into the weeds.
Yeah, sure.
Because that's going to be part of the last thing we talk about. But what I really mean to say here is that there's a false division between spirituality and science. And what they mean by science is really material science, and as a backdrop that is unassailable in some respects, and in other respects is not up for the job of providing us with individual or socially mutually beneficial meaning and institutions and that sort of thing. But what they're lacking, as you mentioned, is the epistemology for a metaphysics, right? For a spirituality. No less does the spiritual need an epistemology. So I'll give you a brief aside. I had an exchange with Matt on a Facebook Metamodern Spirituality site about the end of the Big Bang Theory. Right? And he's rightly describing the problems there. And somebody asked him what his cosmology was, and he said that it's, I'm shorthanding, but that it's influenced strongly by Whitehead and somebody else. And I said, boy, isn't there another influence coming in now? I mean, we are reading this book together called Interdisciplinary Astronomy. And he rightly said, and beautifully said, we have to be able to speak in the language of empiricism, essentially, and with the concepts that are readily available, not with organs that we need to develop later on, right? And then he shared an article. I didn't read it yet. Rudolf Steiner and the Angelic Hierarchy is called. There's an article he wrote, I believe. And my response was, yes, and in the epistemology, we already have a cosmology in seed form, right? And we have an empirical approach that demands a subtle empiricism as relates to the limits we're putting on the subjective self for examining phenomenologically speaking from an empirical point of view. And so that shapes to me, that gives contour to this notion that epistemology in relationship to metaphysics is crucial as it is for any other scientific endeavor. and it gives credence to the idea that there is a spiritual science, and there needs to be, and it needs to be developed, and we need the good scientific minds on it.
Just spinning that thought further, we've also reflected on the fact that Steiner wanted the philosophy of freedom to be called the philosophy of spiritual activity, because thinking is a spiritual activity, and that talks to the point that you're making there. That's like when we really do dig into this activity that lives through us, we are already in communion with the spiritual world. But that is something that can be grown to different levels of consciousness, which we don't need to go into here. But we are already engaging in spiritual activity when we are creating concepts that link us back to Sophia.
Furthermore, it's not helpful to say, "Oh, the virgin birth." Well, we'll have to reconfigure that one with an intellectually contextual, because that's not possible, virgin birth. But I would contend that there is an epistemology that can approach the actual reality of Immaculate Conception. And in fact, isn't it true that we were not always procreating in the manner that we are? And is it possible that we will be self-procreating in the future in a different way, maybe more consciously? Plausible, perhaps. But when you start to juxtapose embryology and astronomy, you start to see the potency that is at the center of creation, at the very local microcosmic place, in relationship to the so-called non-local or expansive infinite space. So all I'm saying is there's plausibility beyond your shoulder shrug, beyond your dismissal of the resurrection, say. And I'm sure that this will enter to some extent, as the philosopher Schickler describes the necessity of that actually to be a fact. But if you're going to say can't happen, it's physically not possible, well, I don't think you really understand physics then.
There was some. I've been listening to Jung talking on the answer to Job, the book from the Old Testament, and just listening to that. And I suspect these guys could listen to that or read that type of thing because of their use of the word individuation, self, and these type of concepts. If you look at that just there, they don't need to look any further, and they can realize, virgin birth, it can have an archetypal significance here, which I could be fully on board with. I don't have to restrict myself to my current understanding of the word, what virgin means. Perhaps it has an archetypal significance, or perhaps it has the significance that Steiner gives to it, which you were also indicating in your description there, which we won't go into here. But Steiner has also covered this question about what's going on at a physical level and what's going on and what it actually represents at an archetypal level, if I use Jungian terminology there. But this is the reason we're able to think in this way that they are indicating they can't is, again, because of this rooting in a mixture of the philosophy of freedom and the results of spiritual science.
Yes, and their sensibility as relates to spirituality, that it starts with a self-limit that's unnecessary.
Yeah. Shall we? So I didn't actually mean to do that, but it was a reasonable segue there. We're looking at the 13-minute mark now. What's going to be happening next? Oh, you've gone silent.
Yeah, I was muted.
Or shall I just?
Jonathan,
Do you want me to just play it, or
let's do that, and then we can
Mhm.
I'll recouch it again.
okay?
Safety blanket, if you like. It's meant to leave you disarmed and kind of open.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, but at the same time, I mean, the reason why, just to, I wouldn't, not even push back, but just to yes and some of this though, there are ways in which sometimes there's unhelpful or even dangerous equivocation around things, right? Where if we can't begin to get a sense of what it is that we're referring to and what is sort of falling into
Yeah.
our ken, it forecloses other affordances. I don't know, just to put one term to it. And so one of the things that I find interesting about trying to define a word like this is that there's something about traditional religion that I think we're very familiar with. When we see it, we know it. You know, it's like there's someone praying, and there's like a scriptural element, and we maybe know people, or maybe we are ourselves someone who grew up in a traditional religious context and all that. And there's a whole thing there that it's sort of like, yes, that's religion. We get that, and I think that is also a lot of the stuff that is excluded from the public discourse in the way that you were talking about. That's kind of precisely what in a kind of polite way we're not going to talk about, because that's sort of personal and let's not go there. And then spirituality though is a kind of more amorphous, a bit more of a wiggly word that in some ways it seems tries to speak to some of that phenomena while also speaking to other phenomena that are in some ways decidedly non or anti-religious even, and yet still speaking to this kind of sensibility. And so I find trying to if not pin that down, which I agree is sort of impossible, but just kind of zero in on what is that? Like, what are these things that both connect and yet divide religious from spiritual folks, spiritual from secular, or spiritual from atheistic folks? And I feel like that can be generative in sort of it getting a sense of, because the last thing I'll say about that is that what you were talking about earlier about the RSA project you were working on and the different groups that you were dealing with is like, there seemed to be something missing, that there was an elephant in the room that people kind of agreed, not to speak about, right? If we're going to kind of do public discourse and have public space and do all that sort of thing, right? And yet is something so important. It's issues of like ultimate concern are the things that we're not going to address, right? And so, I feel like part of this is about opening that up and trying to see, what those things are, and if we're leaving that out, it seems like we're leaving out something really important, both from a kind of social standpoint, but also from a kind of political and policy standpoint of like, what kind of society do we want to live in? What kind of institutions are we setting up? And if we're not dealing with the whole person and we're actually leaving out this sort of gaping void of like where all the most important stuff kind of come together, then kind of no wonder that we live in societies that seem to be unfulfilling or vapid or superficial or whatever. Those are just.
All right, so let me frame that a little bit, because Jonathan, I think in his genuine inquiry but confusion as relates to the difference between soul and spirit, describes soul, and I think he's kind of talking about spirit, the spirit that was the beyond thing. He was trying to talk about it, but what Brendan did was take him up on his word, that we really do need for this not to be taboo, and it can be explored. And if the soul can't be explored, well, never mind the spirit, because it's with the spirit that we delve into the phenomenology of the soul and the self, and it's with the spirit that our self lives by virtue of through thinking. And so we have an actual cogent and coherent approach. I'm not saying a body of knowledge. I in fact said that this is a new science, but not much more new than biology, which we've reified into some very bizarre instrumentalist kind of concepts, which we'll get into when we get to the social problem. But this is exactly where we do need to go. We do need to define what the soul is as relates to the spirit. We do need to understand that the kind of vulnerability it takes to talk about and the deeply personal experience that is the ensoulment process needs to be part of the intimacy of public discourse. And I would say that is a spiritual scientific, it's a demand of the spiritual scientific that we go there, right? That we do the aesthetic move together, that we do art together, that we make ourselves vulnerable in relationship to the reality of the soul and the discovery of this developing self that Brendan gets into later on.
Yeah. I was thinking about what you were saying there, and that an exercise we did with Alexander about the Goethean conversation technique, which is you could use a non-anthroposophical one. True dialogue. What is true dialogue? It's listening without arguing against the person that's talking. And the extent to which we are capable of doing that and living into like the world in which this person lives, and not trying to convince them of the rightness of our world, but nevertheless describing things from our perspective. Because let's say so that they are more grounded in materialism, we can learn something. Okay, we can learn something there. And what is true for us also is true for the other side. By listening and not arguing against, but like saying, that's interesting. I would have never thought of like God and Sophia until like we were rediscovering Sophia. But that's an interesting idea to play with, rather than dismissing it. If we are able, the more we are able to enter into true conversation with people, the more people are going to be able to talk about these things. But we live in a society where that is not a capacity that's really promoted, if I can put it like this. You're supposed to argue your point and kill the other person's arguments. And I'm not saying that perspective doesn't have something valid about it, because it also is, it's like I said, it's a strengthening act that we perform in our soul when we do such a thing. But if we are always critiquing, criticizing, fault finding with the other side's arguments, then we can never find the pearls that that actually live in their worldviews.
I love that Jonathan brings in the social milieu as part of the ecology of what it is to be a human being, and this is really occurring to me in a new way right now as you were talking. One of the things that has, I would say, obscured the mutual evolution of the self, the mutual participation in the evolution of the self, so that we all see that it's real, right? That it's not a construct, it's not a materialistic outgassing or all of these nonsense materialistic notions. That the existentialists were right to in their lane, that we can take that perspective in. But the one of the mechanisms, I would say, mind mechanisms erected by material science that's causing this problem, in my opinion, is the reification of justification. It's justification systems. That's all we do in orientation to either religion or science or social interactions, are all a version of a justification system, right? Whereas when thinking is in the room, there's no need to justify anything. There's a mutual gain for not only for my intellect and my satisfaction of developing concepts and creating, but in the way in which the self becomes more and more vibrantly real in relationship to other people. It's, as Benita Roy says, it's interjected, right? And then it becomes a communal self. The individuation is not the narcissistic individuation. It's the opening up out of the holiest of holies into the universal. And that is a spiritual scientific path. It's just that spiritual science takes science, art, and a kind of religiosity, as relates to religio, to actually achieve. Like it actually, you need all three, and that's the way philosophy of freedom is written, as a work of art, a work of science, and a work of, I would say, ritual movement, mediating between the material and the spiritual.
Yeah. Creating this flow backwards and forwards so that we feel comfortable moving between the two realms, because this is one of the problems that society struggles with, where all the institutions have a heavy bias towards a certain type of thinking, which strengthens that, so like to amazing degrees, and all the technological wonders that we see are a result of that thinking. But what I think one way of describing what these guys are alluding to is the weaknesses inherent in a one-sidedness, and in that sense it's like they are adding something very valuable to the conversation. And as you rightly said, the what we're seeing happening in our societies is unfortunately further testimony to the danger or the dangers of this one-sidedness in acceptable thinking. It's like in public, because we don't talk about it here, but they talk about dropping the G-bomb, talking about God, mentioning it in society. Why has it become prohibited? Why it's not become prohibited by law, but it's socially unacceptable. And even I don't go to church at all. I have in the past. I've gone to church before. And one of the things that has surprised me a lot is the reluctance to actually to talk about what it is that we believe in. It really is quite fascinating.
Yeah. This is an excellent segue, because when Brendan says, no wonder we have such a vapid culture, right? When he's talking about the sort of the valueless the valueless scientific structure, say, as the way to have a common understanding about things, as opposed to a spiritual common understanding that involves also scientific endeavor and inquiry without need for justification. This is he's only half right. It's not vapid. It's a vacuum out of which the values, virtue, and what are the three? Values, virtue, and, well, maybe I'll come back to this, but what ends up happening is we end up with demographics as ethics, right? And we end up with virtue signaling and groupthink as virtue, right? And what we have, instead of this religious impulse alive in our culture, is a closing down of any of that. And then what takes over is the ideology of scientific endeavor, and that's what we just used to manipulate people from around the world, because that's the zeitgeist. We're at that point at which we need to resolve this problem.
Yeah.
And we failed miserably, but out of failure comes this conversation, I would say.
Yeah, it's strengthening that idea that suffering is only useless if we don't use it as a spur to do things better. If I suffer and I take the victim mentality, then nothing is won. But if I use that suffering to try and transform something into something better in society, through better understanding something, then that suffering has actually had a purpose. Understandably, we all have a strong urge to avoid suffering. We certainly don't go out actively seeking it. But I think society could do a lot more to support working through suffering. What is it that suffering can help us learn about ourselves, the extent to which we need to change things and the extent to which we need to change ourselves, change our understanding of how life is and what's my role in society, what's my connection, this whole social question. How and to what extent do I want to fit into a social network? All, it's like deep questions.
Yeah, can we talk about value, virtue, and ideals? Because without that as part of our public discussion, and nobody has the answer to it. We're afraid of suffering is uncertainty, but uncertainty is a glorious place to be as relates to the mysteries, because you're beating back in a certain sense, or you're shining light into a darkness that no longer will be dark because we're doing the work together.
Yeah.
What I was trying to say is values become statistics, becomes ethics in a demographic sense. Virtue becomes virtue signaling and self-righteousness, and ideals become ideologies of groupthink and over certainty about things.
Yeah. The next video we're going to look at is actually going to continue this social question, but Jonathan's going to bring it round to this question of individuation, retaining your individuality, or should I just go to church? Which is really interesting to hear an obviously very smart guy who's thought about these things a lot coming up with this, floating this as an idea. And in this sense, like he's being brave, he's being vulnerable. He's like saying, here are my uncertainties. I see that society, there are deeply unhealthy forces in society. How have we managed this in the past? Yeah, religion has been at the center of it. And so understandably, he's bringing that in. We're going to listen to him, and then you and I are going to reflect on, to what extent we think that is valid or invalid. So,
not to assume that we have a shared metaphysical set of assumptions that to back up, I think it was Habermas who spoke about the breakdown of the value realms in modernity being a big crisis in modernity, that truth, beauty, and goodness were somehow severed from each other. And that really matters, because what you're describing as, on the one hand, we can agree about this in the public realm, and we have the publicly acceptable, intersubjectively ascertainable truth claims that work for certain kinds of natural science, but not much else. Probably doesn't work even for psychology in most cases. You have that, and great, good luck to you. But that you can't build a society on that, right? You can create some tools and medicines and stuff, and great, that will probably help. But it's no basis for a shared life of meaning and purpose worth living. But the question then is it just a matter of adding on to that? Or is it something about the very mentality that says you can separate that off from beauty and goodness dimensions? I don't know quite how one begins to answer that, but you do need to be careful in thinking that somehow you can sort out truth, beauty, and goodness as if they're separate things, because they do bleed into each other in various ways. But coming back to the bigger question, what do we do? So I'm this is right on what I'm wrestling with at the moment. So there's a part of me that would find life a lot easier if I could just sort of go to church, for example, and just say, yeah, it's mysterious, but maybe the resurrection story is true in some historical sense. I can just about explain to myself what it means for what sin might mean, what it would mean for Christ to die on the cross for us. I could give a metamodern spin to that would be more or less compelling. But do I really believe it? And secondly, can I bring it to bear socially and culturally in the way that will bring others with me? There I'm less sure. At least I've yet to find the community or the church or the preacher to bring me that way. But there are inspiring figures out there, metamodern Christian thinkers who are quite impressive. But I'm also partly Hindu. My wife's Indian. And I'm, by sort of intellectual training, I'm a bit more Buddhist. And then I'm kind of skeptical by temperament. So it's a struggle. It's like not easy to go back to sort of one way of seeing the world. And that's quite a metamodern predicament too, right? And I have friends who find that, Christian friends who find that a little frustrating, but also Christian friends who frankly are a bit beyond it and say, look, get over yourself. You just need to surrender to God.
That's what I mean by pre-modern religious orientation or sensibility. Yeah. It'll be profoundly unsatisfying to people to make that move, right?
Yeah.
And but I love his search here, and he's doing it in a way we suggested. That it's vulnerable and brilliant, brilliant mind and sensitive soul. It's lovely to see him go there and to bring in truth, goodness, and beauty.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Just when Brendan was talking about virtues, values, and ideals, there's a contemporary institution called Waldorf education that has rooted itself in the existential and metaphysical and developmental approach, utilizing these seemingly easily explainable words, truth, goodness, and beauty, but they have to do with potential and intellectual and soul freedom, and it has to do with the way the aesthetic sensibility is a training for mediating between certainty and uncertainty, and solution and dissolution. The way things come into being is practiced as a participatory developmental process. So we really have institutions that are built on this.
I got a friend that I speak to on a regular basis. I might have mentioned it before. My Italian friend that I speak to every Friday about, we talk about a whole load of interesting things. And he's talked about in his past about how this was before he knew anything about, he knows about Steiner through me, but before he got interested in Oriental thinking, because he's Italian, brought up in a Catholic milieu. And later on in life, after various events in his life, he started asking more serious questions, and he actively turned to the church, to their courses, and to the priests, asking them questions. And what he found is they're not capable of giving decent answers, satisfying answers. And in that sense, I see my friend reflected in Jonathan here, that there's this is interesting, isn't it? Because in the sense that people, can we call them scientismists? I don't know what we should call them, but people who believe in science is science, and it's the truth, as it's the epitome of what life should be. They don't realize that if they can't explain Einstein's theory of relativity, if they can't explain how we've arrived at the idea, I'm not saying it's true, that the universe is expanding at an increasingly greater speed, if they can't explain how the quantum field theory works and all this stuff, it's just belief. they've taken the authority of belief, and in that sense, scientismists are exactly the same as religious people who take stuff on authority. And so what I'm reflecting on is that the frustration that he's feeling, I think, is partly due to that if he turned to the majority of people involved in religion who have it just on authority that it's like this, rather than they've thought it through, I think he's going to end up being disappointed. And in that sense, so like just surrendering to God ain't going to cut it, because he's made it clear he's interested in truth, beauty, and goodness. And that is one of the challenges, without a shadow of doubt, that people who branch out onto an individual spiritual path, we've all got a lot of self-learning to do about all the assumptions that we've made about life. They have to be called into question, they have to be reevaluated, and we have to replace them with something that works for us. And that's part of what I hear him battling with. His recognition of a lack, not only in his life, but in society at a whole level. So should he just surrender to it? I mean, he might be fortunate. There might be a really switched on priest at his local community, or he might be a dud. He might be a priest who doesn't believe in the virgin birth, that doesn't believe in the resurrection, that doesn't believe that Christ was the Son of God, that doesn't even know there's a difference between Jesus and Christ. And in which case he has to take even more responsibility to find people who are capable of expanding his notions about what might be behind this religion that's really does it for some people. That was one of the thoughts that was triggered in me, because he was talking about resurrection and sin. He's got, understandably, rightly so, he's got questions around these big fundamental Christian questions. I think where you and I feel we might be able to be of value to such a conversation is that we've reached a certain level of clarity. Whether it's enough to be able to help this person find what they're looking for, we can't know that. But I mean, I grew up in an atheist family. I know I have found something, and I'm grounded in science. So my one life is testimony to the fact that it is possible. Whether he can find that route, he talks about his inherently skeptical nature. I'm skeptical as well. I'm skeptical, but when I see the truth, I play with it and test it like a true scientific mind will, and see if it's adequate. But also the important thing is not rejecting something as well. You don't have to embrace. You neither have to embrace nor reject. Just leave it lying there and see if the idea grows as a means of explaining what at first feels like something too far out there.
Yeah, he does it's important, I think, to remember that he led this segment off with perhaps I don't share the metaphysical assumptions. And you could think he was talking about religion, but he wasn't. He was talking about the scientific paradigm, because it is built on metaphysical assumptions.
Yeah.
The other thing he does in relationship to religion is say, perhaps we can pull this back and think about it as an aesthetic endeavor, religion. And again, that's not enough, right? You can't hang it on beauty. You can't hang it on the aesthetic. The aesthetic is that which we ritualize, that which we move through. It's like dreaming while awake, because it mediates between, let's say, lessons learned in life that you would otherwise regret.
Mm-hmm.
And you're practicing through aesthetic ritual the overcoming of karmic knots, say. And you can, at this point, I can take, we could do a whole program on the epistemology of karma.
Mm-hmm.
And it would lead us to the epistemology of the resurrection, right? Which is not something that needs to be recontextualized intellectually. We're just abstracting away from what I would say is a reality. But you don't have to believe that, but you can remain open to it. What is this resurrection? What is this idea of self-reproduction, say, something like that?
Yeah.
And what is that? Is that an inherent potential? And beautifully, Brendan brings in will in the next segment. So that's a segue,
just on that, because you've toyed with the idea of resurrection, isn't every time we move forward in our own development, that is a metaphorical resurrection, and the question becomes like, is that ultimately reproducible? That's like at a body level.
It's more than metaphorical.
Exactly.
It's symbolic. It's symbolic, and I will keep coming back to this word symbolic, because it's the only word we have for that which is representative and transparently the thing also. It's the gesture. It's the word, the concept, the thinking. It's all aligned, sort of planetarily aligned. And what we're doing with the self and what we've become ideologically attached to is identity. And the self is an identity that we create, but we also dissolve it and recreate it. But there's a constancy about it. There's a continuity biographically. And so now we're moving into the notion of karma, right? And now we're moving into I can tell you as a father that my children came in with their own thematic life, not just characterological dispositions. That is a constraint. It's important for the self to be meeting in order to more and more be broken apart in order to resolve back into a more aligned version of the intention, deeply seated in the will as full potential.
Whilst you were describing it like that, I was also thinking about wisdom. It's the idea of recognizing in the particular concept we're playing with at the moment, resurrection, how it happens at multiple levels. It isn't just restricted to like the Christian resurrection. If I'm going to get to know the truth, what I start looking at in life. So I was watching I was watching a film with my daughter about jellyfish the other day, like these immortal beings, or that they're resurrecting themselves. So to what extent can I actually find examples of a type of resurrection, so like already existent in life? Because once I familiarize myself with like the reality of it already existing in nature, then the idea that it might be possible actually at a bodily spiritual level doesn't become as absurd. And I think this ties in a little bit to what he was saying. He talks about his ignorance about like Christianity, what it actually means. And I think this is a journey that I've definitely been on, and you might have been on. I don't know enough about your own background in terms of church and that type of thing. But that was like a big part of my process in my 20s. I had hardly ever even looked at a Bible until I was 25, but then I started having questions about it, and you look at these questions and you start finding answers, and they open up new questions, and you get deeper and deeper and deeper into this, and realizing that these what were bandied around as superficial concepts, there's actually something really of depth in them. And if you take your studies, your learning seriously, you emerge from that learning process with a far richer conceptual life, which then gives you the ability to see that richness out in life again. And just to finish off that idea there, so a materialist will say, it's like, it will take all the evidence of the world to say, this is why we don't need God. And then somebody like me will take exactly the same evidence, and so they say, that's exactly that. What you've just provided there is proof that there is God. God and the spiritual world is something real. It is something that's creating in there. So we're using identical evidence to arrive at completely opposite conclusions. And this was, in my case, this is only possible because of my deepening of the understanding of the concepts that are involved in religion. And it's not like solely based in Christianity. I've looked a lot at like Eastern thinking as well. But this fundamental idea that it's like the materialists have proved there's no God. No, they haven't. It's far more complicated than that.
Yeah, I love that Brendan also brings in his biography as relates to religion, because it's revealing of something. Mm-hmm. And he's struggling with the tension between, but he describes coming out of a religious family and then studying it from an anthropological and a historical perspective, which is exactly where you're not going to find anything spiritual. It is ultimately a super modern conception and orientation toward spiritual life, to treat it as if it were some sort of product of history and something that could be studied as an artifact, right? Right, as opposed to something that is ontogenetic and is reproducing itself constantly. And that from our conception, the Christ was there in all of the plurality of religions, and it was understood by the early church fathers that was the case. It was also understood by those other traditions, that there was something coming to a light, right? There was something coming, right? Full stop at that point, which is probably the segue we need for the next one.
Yeah. So the final bit, we've got an easy question to end on. What is reality? That's the question they're asking. A very nice simple question to finish off with. It's nice to hear them reflecting on this, and then we shall also reflect on their answer. Sorry. Yeah. I'll go back. I've missed the beginning. He said, so like a very nice. Okay.
It makes sense in the mystical sense, but yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing that I wanted to ask you about, I suppose, is, I'm thinking of Jeffrey Kripal's work a little bit, but just generally the sense that reality might just be so very different from how we assume it to be, and that there might be these other beings in some kind of other dimension that we can't access, and that some occult phenomenon might be true, and that God knows there might be UFOs, and who knows, even astrology might have some validity, like all sorts of things. And I don't mean that as some kind of hand waving, who knows what's going on.
No, I know.
I mean something more like, I'm at a stage of life where, having looked at these things with some care and experienced many of them, I can't honestly say I know what the fabric of reality is like. It remains a big conundrum, and I suspect it probably always will. But I also know that the kind of person who wakes up in the morning and does an I Ching reading to figure out how to live their day is quite different from the one who puts on the lab coat and goes in to do an experiment. And their spirituality is unlikely to be the same. So somehow the metamodern spirituality you're alluding to, what does it have then? It has something about individuation in there, but maybe I sometimes speak about collective individuation, and I do that to distinguish it from just the kind of individual by themselves, but rather in the historical moment they individuate in order to relate and serve the sort of time they're in. There's something about individuation or collective individuation, something about epistemic plurality, knowing that there are multiple ways of knowing, something about ontological plurality, knowing there are multiple visions of what is real, something about metaphysical imagination, and then something about a dignified relationship to what's gone before that's non-naive and non-coerced, such that you can live all of that wholeheartedly and fully and cry through it, saturated by it, and know that some of it is more, in some sense, more real than the rest of it, but you might never know which part is which, and the whole of it has its own reality that you have to live. Something like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's beautiful. That's a beautiful summary. And I guess maybe to sum that up, there's a epistemic humility that's attached to it all as well. When you're
It sounds like somebody wanting to get closer to the truth. I mean, what a wonderful attitude. If you're interested in the truth, then you don't dismiss astrology because it's dismissed by the establishment. It might be that it's got nothing to do with reality, but until you actually investigate it, talk with people who really know this field very well, you're only ever going on traded assumptions, and you never know. You might actually discover there's something really deeply profound going on there. But again, I suppose it's coming back to my example with my Italian friend. It depends on the quality of your teacher. If you get an astrologist that's like just trading like old authority principles that have been handed down on the basis of authority, rather than somebody who knows this stuff from the inside out and is able to help you work through your reservations about, let's say, astrology or ufology. I don't know. I don't feel as if I need to have a position on these in this conversation, because it's the attitude towards truth here that's going to help anybody move forward. And I think it's really nice to hear him reflecting on that. And the other reflection that I've got on what he's saying is this process of individuation, which is something I feel I can wholeheartedly feel is absolutely, completely reconcilable using a completely different language with how Steiner's describing the world. We are spiritual beings. There are elements of the spiritual world that at the moment I have no idea about. But I do believe it's possible through my own work and through the grace of those other worlds for me to grow my consciousness into those areas. And these are images they're happy with using. It's like the ego is that part about which we're conscious, but we can grow the ego in the sense that we can use it to become conscious of areas of our soul, in our language, of the spiritual world, about which we were not conscious earlier. So I think this is a wonderful example of how we're speaking a bilingualism. That we're talking about the same thing, we're using different language to describe it, but in the different use of our languages, also we can begin to pick up on subtleties of slightly different meanings going on there, which then can become fruitful for a conversation. So you talk about individuation. Why, if I was in conversation with Jonathan and Brendan, for example, I hear you talk about individuation. It resonates strongly with me. Tell me a little bit about like what it is and how does it happen, and examples in your life and that type of thing. And then that can either lead to questions where I might feel that something is not being taken into consideration in that question, or they might like turn it around and say, okay, how would you describe it using your own words? And so that can end up in a fruitful conversation. Yeah.
Where Brendan goes here after this is really special place, I think, and he really pulls Jonathan along.
You mean with the epistemic humility? Is that the bit you're talking about?
Beyond that, when he's
Right.
talking about the importance of the plurality, so to speak. Of course, pluralism isn't the answer. Multi-perspectival inquiry is the manner, and then the eye of the needle is the epistemology, which isn't multi-epistemics, right? It's multi-sensibilities, it's multi-points of view, but epistemically, it's traceable to thinking, and the process of cognition as relates to that, right? And the role of ensoulment in that process developmentally. So Zach Stein talks very beautifully about all the ways in which we are developing as human beings. But epistemically, there's it's a pretty clear, simple and elegant reality, say.
Yeah.
And I think this idea, then we wouldn't be saying that that there needs to be a difference between the person throwing I Ching and the person in the lab coat. They could both be wearing a lab coat and both be looking at astrology, for example, right? And I'm struck by the fact that Brendan brings in Greg Enriquez, who we're going to be talking to very soon, and Greg is talking to Matt Siegel, which is a really interesting thing because I'm pretty sure Greg would say the same thing about astrology. Bullshit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas Matt is very seriously steeped in a growing understanding of the way astrology reflects reality, at least reflects reality, and is something of the reality of the nature of existence can be. It is something of the nature of existence. When we hear Matt talk about it with Greg, we're going to find, I think, some common ground.
That'd be interesting to hear
that. And then this idea that there are multiple visions of reality, of ontology. This is not quite right. There are multiple ontologies. There are multiple ontological realms.
Yeah.
And they're not relative because they're real. Right? It's not like there's many visions of reality. No, there are many realities, and those realities have to be taken on their own and can be done so both with astrology and with the lab coat. Right?
And then they're synthesized in the self. That's where it's like these seemingly like ridiculously irreconcilable like two aspects of reality, they can find the unity in the self. And this is the values, like these, let's stick with like Steiner stuff here. So like the 12 worldviews, they are all valid. The dangers start when we start talking about one being more valid than the other. They are different ways of describing reality, and when we can learn to embrace all the different ways, the multi-perspectival view that you used and that Jonathan used in here as well, that's when we feel ourselves, the individuation process, like strengthening us instead of having to reject certain phenomena that other people call real. You go, yeah, I can get that. And how does that fit together with like all the other knowledge that I bring from other segments of the like the 12 worldview model that I might work with?
Yeah, while we're on this, I think that the nature of complexity, which is so much part of these folks' vocabulary, and my contention is they're on the right track with this individuation concept. And I think Brendan goes farther into it. But what's happening, I believe, in the evolution of consciousness, and where individual development meets evolution of consciousness development and evolution as a whole, is that we're individuating into the complexity that already exists. It's not a static complexity. Part of it is liquid. It's evolving by the definition we just described. But we are individuating into the ability to perceive the complexity in something like a field, say, right? Yeah. And not outstanding in a field, not a wheat field, but in a fabric of existence that is, as you were saying beautifully, synthesized in the self as it evolves, develops, and dissolves and resolves, and that it's the human heart that perceives that constantly, and that's becoming more and more of a conscious activity, as people like the Heart Math Institute and Dennis Klosek's work on the etheric heart really describe for us. It is an individuation into this body that has a soul as its material that leads into the actual incarnation into the physical body with the spiritual. Talking about the word spiritualize, the name of Jonathan's book, this is the spiritualization process.
Okay, final words for me, and then you can wrap this up. So everything you just said was there in seed form in God and Sophia. We are rediscovering Sophia in ourselves. And we did a series of videos, Sophia, Philosophia, Anthroposophia, where we talked on this. But this is also sort of coming to life in a new way as we talk about this process, how this being, the being of wisdom, Sophia, that is what we are trying to approach slowly and slowly. And it is through thinking and through her son, Michael, that we are walking this path towards reconnecting with that which is at the basis of all existence.
Beautiful. What you said, I hear as we're growing in intimacy with reality, a complex reality that has multi-dimensions. And that reality has the relationship of beings that we're becoming intimate with and enjoining. So Klosek talks about the 12 senses as each sense having a low frequency and a high frequency. And perception here is the key. When I perceive this through the sense of smell, am I addicted to the allurement, or do I, like in Hamlet fashion, smell a rat, smell something rotten in Denmark, right? Do I smell, is it a moral frequency, right? Because that's where truth, goodness, and beauty exists within the actuality of existence through beings in relationship to each other.
That seems like a very good time to press the button. Pressing button.